The Empress spent 2 days in Bern. She received the Princess of Wales, who had stayed there to see her on her way to Rome, where she intended to spend the winter, and invited her to dinner. The princess seemed to be about 45 years old at that time. She was short and very fat. She had large, pronounced features and eyes, which, rightly or wrongly, betrayed some of the adventures which were generally attributed to her. Her suite was composed of a lady-in-waiting and 4 officers. I admit that I was very curious indeed to see this princess, who became historical by the scandal with which the English filled Europe concerning her and the Prince Regent. The evening was of the gayest. We had some music with General Nyberg at the piano. The Empress asked the princess to sing, and she consented to do so, on condition that Marie-Louise should sing with her. The Empress said that she was so timid that she was unable to bring forth a sound when anybody was listening to her. The princess encouraged her, saying that as far as she was concerned, she was never frightened except for her friends. As a matter of fact, and to tell the truth, she sang with a voice of which I will say nothing, except that it really showed this princess's courage. One of her plans was to go and visit the emperor at Elba. She was traveling with a child about 12 years old, which had a very pretty face. She had not brought him to the empress's house. This was the famous Austen, who was so much spoken about in the memoirs published under her name, memoirs which she publicly disavowed as a libelous pamphlet. She said that as she did not know who was the child's father, but she loved it just as much as she loved her daughter. She was dressed in an ample white muslin dress trimmed with lace. Her head was adorned with a large veil, rather like those worn by the priestesses of Greek tragedies, which covered her waist, her shoulders, and both sides of her bosom. This veil was fastened with a diadem of diamonds. She also wore a magnificent necklace of several rows of pearls and traveled in this array. Apart from this, in spite of her figure and dress, which frankly might be styled curious, the Princess of Wales had the appearance of an excellent woman, simple, straightforward, and putting everybody at his ease. Her lady-in-waiting's figure was not less singular than her mistress's. The officers were of very good appearance. One of them was the son of a celebrated Englishwoman, Lady Craven, who married the Margrave of Anspach. The other 2 were young officers of the Prince of Wales's regiment. The 4th was Dr. Holland, who was said to be a very good doctor. We left Bern to return to Vienna, traveling through the small cantons. The Empress was accompanied by General Nyberg and his adjutant Hrabowski, Countess de Brignoles, Madame Hérault, and her husband, etc., etc. Monsieur de Coucy had returned to Paris. Monsieur de Bessay and Madame Hérault de Sorbet, one of the 2 dames de noces, who had followed the Empress on her departure from Paris, had preceded her to Lindau, where they were awaiting her with the carriages. Marie-Louise desired also to visit the ruins of the castle of Rudolph de Habsburg. General Nyberg, charged to recall her to the seductions of her native land, could not dispense her from a visit to the cradle of the founder of the House of Austria. He even declared that a piece of iron which he found there was a fragment of Rudolph's lance. The Empress lent herself complacently to this fiction. Little pieces of this iron cut up were used for the settings of some rings which she had made in Vienna and which she gave to General Nyberg, Monsieur de Bassay, and myself as the insignia of the new order of the knighthood, and to Madame de Brignoles as a souvenir of this journey. The Empress took so much pleasure in all her excursions that I had reason to expect that her journey would be prolonged. I understood only too well how disagreeable her position would have been in Vienna to be surprised at this, but I was impatient to get there. The necessity of getting the letters which were waiting for me in the city and my interest in their contents made it imperative for me to return. I was, moreover, of no utility whatever to the Empress. After having urged me to continue, she was good enough to yield to my arguments and grant me permission to go. I left her at Schweitz, but to my great surprise, she arrived at Schönbrunn 3 days after me, on the feast day of the Emperor Francis, to whom she had given me a letter. She had made her way to Vienna from Schweitz by St. Gall, Constance, Munich, and Braunau. She had passed the night in the last town, her memory taking her back 4 years, when she had been received there as Empress of the French, and when she left it to go and take triumphant possession of a throne, the glory of which she came to share. What feelings must have agitated her on finding herself back in this town in so different a position. She had the pleasure of embracing her son, who had remained at Schönbrunn with Madame de Montesquieu. The young prince was tender and caressing towards her. He was in a flourishing state of health and had not suffered from the slightest indisposition during his mother's absence. The Emperor Francis came to see his daughter as soon as he heard of her arrival. The Empress of Austria, who was somewhat indisposed by the fatigues of the various ceremonies in which she had been forced to appear, had remained in Vienna. The way in which Count Neipperg had fulfilled his mission was approved of by their majesties, for he was at once appointed to act as chamberlain to the Duchess of Parma during the Congress. Marie-Louise found all the sovereigns assembled in Vienna. The kings of Denmark, Bavaria, Württemberg, and other princes had preceded the Emperor of Russia and the King of Prussia there. These sovereigns had made their solemn entry into Vienna on September 25th, 1814, accompanied by the Emperor of Austria, who had gone to meet them, and followed by the whole of his court. The imperial family of Austria had received all these sovereigns in a magnificent manner. The emperors and the kings lodged in the imperial palace, where they were entertained with the most sumptuous hospitality. The expense which the assembly of these various princes occasioned to the court was enormous. 1,500 servants and 1,200 horses were added to the imperial household. Carriages with horses constantly put to, and saddle horses were at the service of each sovereign and of the officers of his household. Each had a private table sumptuously served at the emperor's expense. Dinner was served at 2 in the afternoon and supper at 10 in the evening. Splendid fetes diverted these noble guests from their political labors, for the Congress had not yet been open at the time of which I am speaking. It was only to last a few weeks to settle the interests of the secondary German states, the Treaty of Paris having vested the great powers with the territories which they had adjudged themselves and put them in possession of the same. The Empress Marie-Louise, confined with her son in the chateau of Schönbrunn, lived there in absolute retirement, a stranger to all the amusements and display which surrounded the sovereigns in Vienna. She awaited the day when justice should be done to her, relying on the faith of a treaty and on her father's feelings. 5 days after her return to the chateau, a fete was given there, at which all the sovereigns were present. There were drives in open carriages in the gardens, a theatrical performance, and supper in the Orange House. The Empress remained shut up in her apartments all day long, not daring to go out for fear of meeting faces whose triumphant expression would have contrasted too strongly with the obscurity of the position which had been forced upon her. Although the sight of the amusements which celebrated events which had been so disastrous for her could not but afflict her, she had nevertheless curiosity enough to enjoy the sight of the court ball incognito, watching it through a window let into the attic of the grand hall of the Palace of Vienna. 4 years ago, she had been the queen of a brilliant fete given in the same hall on the occasion of her marriage. The reflections which the contrast of her past greatness with her present situation awoke in her should have sufficed to make her turn her back forever on such sights. At the same time, her want of occupation and the need of emotions caused by souvenirs, although these were important, sometimes attracted her back to them. Marie-Louise was presented to the Empress of Russia by the Empress of Austria, and the same time returned the visit of the Grand Duchesses of Russia, who had called on her at Schönbrunn first 2 days after her arrival. The sovereigns were waiting for somebody to break the ice before going to call upon her. The King of Bavaria had said that if the Emperor of Russia would set the example, they would all follow it. Alexander's gallantry, or rather his vanity, had no need of any such stimulus. He came to Schönbrunn with the Austrian general, Count Hardegg. The kings and princes followed. The empress received the kings and queens, the princesses and princes, whom the Congress had assembled in Vienna, one after the other. She also admitted to pay their court the same persons whom she had seen before her departure for Aix. Prince de Ligne was one of the most attentive. He was an old man of 80, whom time seemed to have forgotten. His straight figure, above the middle height, his noble gait, even his field marshal's uniform, and the grace with which he used a stick, which he did not seem to want for the purpose of support, gave an air of distinction to his person. His head was crowned with a forest of gray hair, the parasite denizens of which used sometimes to stray out on the chairs on which he sat. He had a fine face, but his sodden eyes did not betoken the keen wit and power of vivacious repartee which won for him a European reputation. I remember one of his good sayings about the emperor, whom he described as afflicted with a satyriasis for glory. The saying was in conformity with the style of wit in vogue at the Congress. Prince Lambesc, whose name is inseparable from the first events of the Revolution of 1789, used also to come rather often to present his homage to the Empress Marie Louise. He used to wear long riding boots, covered with a varnish which he asserted that he prepared himself, but the smell of which did not say much in favor of his olfactory nerves. On her return to Schönbrunn, she resumed the mode of life which she had followed during her first stay. We took our meals, so to speak, en famille, in dress coats and top boots. Walks, some visits, billiards, music were the chief amusements of this familiar country house life. Tuesdays and Saturdays were devoted to some invitations, as the Empress wished to be free during the rest of the week. She used to leave Schönbrunn almost every day at 1 o'clock to go and see her father. Sometimes she would take her son with her. This young prince was only taken to the Emperor of Austria on solemn occasions, on feast or birthdays. The youngest of the Emperor's sons, Archduke Francis, whose age most nearly approached his nephew's, used to come rather often to Schönbrunn to spend a few days with him. Marie-Louise met with real kindness towards herself and her child only from her father and her sisters. The rest of the imperial family did not take the interest in the child which was due to his age and his position. The Empress and her brothers-in-law spoke of nothing less than making a bishop of him. The emperor was sometimes obliged to force them to keep silence. These hostile sentiments against Napoleon and his son were shared by a crowd of subaltern agents and writers whom the sharing of the spoils of the French Empire had attracted to Vienna, and found an echo in a certain class of Viennese. During one of the Empress's visit to one of the foreign princesses, a crowd of sightseers who had gathered round her carriage expressed their opinion that it was very bad taste on her part to have retained the imperial French arms on the panels of her carriages and on the buttons of her servants' liveries. These remarks obliged Marie-Louise to change them. Her uncles rarely came to see her. The youngest Archduke Rudolph, who under the appearance of health hid a complication of diseases, took advantage of the moments when these diseases left him at peace to visit his niece. He was very amiable and very gentle. His constant sufferings had given an expression of melancholy of his features. He was a great musician and painted agreeably. Sometimes he would improvise at the piano, and whilst doing so would often be attacked by a nervous attack, the violence of which used to make him faint. The Emperor of Austria, accompanied by The Emperor of Russia and the King of Prussia left at the end of October for Hungary. The Emperor Alexander showed himself at the Emperor Francis's side on his entry into Buda, dressed in a Hungarian uniform. The Austrian monarch's confidence, taken in connection with the secret designs attributed to the Tsar on some of the provinces of Hungary, seemed imprudent to the Hungarians attached to the House of Austria. We had reached the last days of October, and the Congress had not yet set to work, which justified Prince de Ligny's well-known saying, "The Congress dances, but does not go." At the same time, in the midst of the tumult of balls, banquets, and amusements of every kind which each day brought with it, the most serious questions were being debated, but they were so complicated and so divergent were the interests at stake that it was difficult to establish the basis on which to found the drafting of the various definite treaties. The Empress's interests were subjected to the same oscillations. On her return to Vienna, there began for her a series of vicissitudes, the object of which was to gain time and to complicate the question of the possession of the duchies of Parma. The Vienna cabinet pretended to decline from a feeling of delicacy to listen to any proposal in favor of Marie-Louise. The Emperor Alexander protested his intention of maintaining the stipulation of the Fontainebleau Treaty of April 11th, which assured the sovereignty of Parma to the Empress. The politics of Russia were not interested in this question. Prussia and England only attached but slight importance to it. The government of Louis XVIII and Spain, on the other hand, manifested the most violent opposition. Marie-Louise, once so lofty, had fallen so low that she and her son could be disposed of without consulting her. The interest which she could hope for was purely gratuitous. It could only become efficacious by a docility on her part which would suffice to dissipate the mistrust which, as the wife of Napoleon, she inspired. The only prince who seemed to defend her cause then was Alexander, who never lost an opportunity of parading chivalrous sentiments. The lady who had been Empress of the French played in Vienna the roles of a suitor who had no access to her judges, whose family, though strong enough to defend her, observes a despairing neutrality, and who has no support but the interested zeal of a friend and the protection of a powerful man, anxious rather to do himself credit by his good offices than to render her real services. Her declared adversaries were the Spanish plenipotentiaries, the former queen of Etruria, charged with the guardianship of her son, not having been able to obtain for him the restitution of Tuscany ceded in 1801 to the infant of Parma. Her husband had thrown herself back on the duchies of Parma, the paternal inheritance of this son. This princess's claim were supported by the Spanish legation with an obstinacy to which the most hostile feelings against the Emperor Napoleon gave fresh force. The French plenipotentiaries favored this pretension. The Austrian cabinet, whose policy tended to the invasion of the Italian peninsula, strongly desired, though without letting it be seen, to see an Austrian archduchess in possession of the duchies of Parma, amongst which Piacenza moreover afforded a strong military position. The Emperor Francis, however, to whom his cabinet wished to give the merit of disinterestedness, or whose scruples it apparently wished to respect, offered to leave the decision as to his daughter's interest in the hands of the Allies, as well as the settlement of the indemnity to which she was entitled. He carried his abnegation to the point of consenting to the proposal made by France that this indemnity should be taken out in fiefs in Bohemia, known by the name of the Bavarian Palatinates, belonging to the Grand Duke of Tuscany, with reversion to the Emperor Francis's domain. These fiefs were later on assigned to Napoleon's son in compensation for the succession to the states of Parma, which was refused to him. These estates consisted of lands situated in Bunzlau, Czeslau, Klattau, Lümeritz, and Recknitz districts.